Welcome back to Get Down to Business, the show all about small business, jobs, and entrepreneurship. What a great conversation with Maureen Wozniak from the Better Business Bureau. So speaking of business, I'm thrilled to be joined by Chris Petersen, who unfortunately wasn't able to join us here in studio. But Chris, welcome to the program.
Oh, Shalom, thank you so much for having me on. Yeah, I am sorry I couldn't make it in person today, but hopefully, we'll get back to Chicago another time.
Absolutely, but your roots are here, and I know that you have quite an interesting story of entrepreneurship. You went to University of Illinois at Champaign, and tell us a little bit about your story from sort of how your ideas developed and where you are now.
Yeah, so basically, I grew up actually in the western suburbs out in St. Charles, and just kind of spent the childhood out there. And eventually, when I went to college, I went to Boston College out in the East Coast, and I did so on an ROTC scholarship. And so, kind of in exchange for the Army paying for school, I owed 4 years afterwards as an Army officer. So I spent a couple of years on active duty in the early 2000s, from 2000 to 2004. And then when I left the military, I just kind of, bounced around a little bit. I moved to Chicago, and I actually worked for Governor Blagojevich when he, prior to him being incarcerated. I worked for him for a little bit, and eventually decided that I needed to get more of a business background, and ended up down in Champaign in the full-time MBA program there at Illinois. And that's kind of what the path that led me there. I happened to be enrolled as a full-time business school student then from 2007 to 2009, which I'm sure all of your listeners remember. That was basically the depths of the Great Recession.
Yep.
And while I was there, I was working part-time actually in the career department, just, helping out where I could. And I was taking, that fall of 2008, I had started to take calls from corporations that had basically, they were really either eliminating or slowing down their hiring, and they were telling the career department, hey, look, we're going to, postpone our visits on campus and really not doing recruiting anymore. I kind of saw the writing on the wall personally at that point and realized that, if I was in business school as a career changer, and I just saw that there was going to be a very limited window of opportunity for me to actually find meaningful employment after business school on campus, and so I needed to find another way to do that.
So, Chris, you've been through pretty much every stage of a business. You've been talking a little bit about sort of the idea phase, but let's talk a little bit about the sort of the execution. And what I find fascinating, Chris, about your business is that it's a business that really has a tremendous social impact. Let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so, the short version of this was, what I ultimately did was myself and a couple of classmates down at Champaign, we'd all been in the military. And basically what we said was like, look, we identified a white space opportunity. And for us, that was, back in 07, 08, 09, the government was putting a lot of pressure on the private sector to do more to hire military veterans. And we said, well, look, in a bad economy, how is it going to be possible for these big Fortune 500 companies to actually do that in a way when veterans are a small percentage of the population? And we kind of looked around and said, you know what, probably the easiest way to do that is to create a hiring conference. And we did that, and that's exactly what we did. We said, well, look, why don't we create our own hiring conference? We'll do it in Chicago. We'll bring in veterans like ourselves from across the Midwest and then ultimately the United States. And we even had people from overseas join us at some of our conferences. And we just took this very simple but effective model of networking, which is a conference model, and we just created an event out of it that just turned into a pretty robust business.
Absolutely.
Over time.
So, Chris, your first event in Chicago in 2009, you had 15 companies, 140 veterans, which is just incredible, featured in the Wall Street Journal. And that led to you created some software. What I find fascinating, Chris, is the sort of how you have leveraged and you spent every moment throughout the business constantly focused on what's next and trying to find a way to make it more effective. Chris, there obviously I'm fascinated by this story and the impact that you've been able to have. But at what point did you determine that sort of what the end game would be? That obviously the more impact you can have, the more veterans you can help, the more attention, frankly, that you can raise on this very important issue is all well and good. But did you all along have an exit plan in place?
No, absolutely not. I think that the best way to describe me is I'm an accidental entrepreneur, right? Where I don't think it was, I was always kind of a hustler as a kid, but I never had envisioned starting a company, and certainly not a company that I would ultimately sell. I really what ended up happening was I was running this business as eventually as a side gig. So I had a full-time job with Procter & Gamble. Ultimately left the Chicago area. I moved to Cincinnati, and I had actually gotten that job through one of these conferences that we had created. And I was running this business because it was kind of a labor of love. I really enjoyed helping other veterans. I had found success through it. I knew we could help other people. I really liked helping corporations out as well, too. And because it was an annual event, it was something that was cyclical, and I was able to focus some energy on it on nights and weekends. However, and I did that actually for 5.5 years. My business partner and I both did it as a side gig. But like any business, eventually it starts to, if it's successful, it'll sort of take off in its own direction. And my capacity to operate it sort of as a side thing was ending by about 2015. And so what I decided to do was let me jump full in on this. Let's see where we can take it. That was really the point where we tried to figure out how are we going to grow. We decided we needed to leave our jobs to do it. So we went full time in the fall of 2015 and left the business. And then from there, we started thinking about what is the future of this company and where does it go? And as it started to grow, my business partner and I realized that, we didn't want to be doing this business ourselves personally when we were 45 or 50 years old. We also knew that without building a bigger team, we weren't the sort of ability for us to grow the business as a small shop was going to require additional investment in people and resources and things like that. And we kind of evaluated two options. One was doing exactly that. Let's go out and find people and hire them and train them to run the business as we grow it. Or let's try to consider maybe finding a strategic partner that wants to acquire us, bring us into the fold, and then we can use their pre-existing resources to actually make that growth possible. And so we debated back and forth which of those two we were going to go, and ultimately we decided that we would begin to evaluate selling the company.
And I know, Chris, that fast forward through a couple of details, you ended up I guess it was last year. You ended up essentially going through the process that ended up resulting in the sale. But Chris, we only have a couple of minutes, and I want to make sure that we get some really critical advice for some of our entrepreneurial listeners that are out there. Chris, you and your partners, you certainly seem to be, I guess, imaginative and creative people. What advice do you have for our listeners that are out there that have a lot of ideas? How did you determine that your idea is going to have some merit and actually will be a success? Did you come up with multiple ideas, or was this the one that you knew it is going to be a winner?
Well, I think the reason we knew it would be successful is that no one was in the space. We knew that there would be companies were looking to hire more veterans, and they were looking to find people that there was just a niche. We basically found a super premium niche that no one was operating in, and we really felt like we could go after now. And we just basically had this sort of grit and determination and perseverance to sort of see it come to fruition. And we just kind of saw a market opportunity and jumped at it. And that was actually something that we did over the course of time. So we started out with one brand, one business, and we evolved it into 4 distinctive events, 4 distinctive brands that were sort of tailored to different audiences within the veteran community, different customer groups. And that was what enabled us to grow over time. So every time we felt like there were kind of line extensions of that portfolio. Every time we couldn't go after every single idea, but the ones that either our customers were asking us for, or we just kind of saw a market opportunity for it. Those are the ones that we decided to go chase.
What about inspiration? Both those that inspired you to help veterans, but also, for our listeners that are hearing everything that you've talked about, what organizations, what books would you recommend that our listeners sort of get in touch with and do some research on?
So for us, the best decision that we made, and I would make this recommendation to any small business owner, 2 things. One is there are business brokers out there who are specialists in helping small businesses and medium-sized businesses not just sell their businesses, but they'll help to evaluate yours and help you figure out what improvements you could make to make your business more attractive to a prospective buyer. We started talking to a couple business brokers. That was really instrumental, and I recommend connecting with the International Business Brokers Association. I think they're out of Chicago.
Chris Petersen, I'm going to have to leave it there. We're about to be cut off. Thank you so much for sharing your story. I'd love to have you back on when you're in Chicago. Thanks for sharing your story with us. You're listening to Get Down to Business. We'll be right back.